What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com. Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 16 Sleepers and Studs. These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button and hit that bell icon so you don't miss our new videos. In this video, I'm going to give my top DFS picks for fantasy football Week 16. I'm going to give you a sleeper and a stud from each position. And if you stay to the very end after all my picks and after I show you the draft dashboard tools, I'll give you my super secret sleeper pick that no one's talking about. My Week 16 quarterback stud is Drew Brees from the New Orleans Saints playing the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall and give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Look guys, Drew Brees hasn't played well, only scoring 7, 16, and 8 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He averages 22.1 fantasy points per game on the season. Drew Brees is $6,500 DraftKings salary. He's $1,900 more on FanDuel, projected at 20.4 fantasy points here in Week 16. This is a home game for Drew Brees. I think he's going to be low owned because of his poor performance over the past few weeks. He is due for a big game. The matchup is good. Pittsburgh gives up a lot of fantasy points to quarterbacks and wide receivers. I like Drew Brees in a bounce back game versus the Pittsburgh Steelers here in Week 16. Okay, let's take a look at a low salary quarterback who may fly under the radar. I like Dak Prescott from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Tampa Bay Bucks, who have the 2nd worst defense overall and give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Dak Prescott has scored 7, 30, and 15 fantasy points in the last 3 games, averaging 18.1 fantasy points per game on the season. He gets almost 5 rush attempts per game. He didn't have any rush attempts last game. That may have been a reason why he only got 7 fantasy points. Dak Prescott is $5,700 DraftKings salary, projected at 19.1 fantasy points here in Week 16. This is a home game for Dak. The matchup is fantastic. He's got Amari Cooper. He's got Ezekiel Elliott. He has the weapons to put up big numbers. I think the matchup is right, and I love the price. I like Dak Prescott versus the Tampa Bay Bucks here in Week 16. For a limited time only, we are still offering our 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all of our DFS tools for all sports. You can try the Position Optimizer, where you can see the top players ranked for each position. And we added a new Player Trends tool, where you can see the top salary differences between FanDuel and DraftKings. It's a really good tool to help you pick out value for the site that you're playing on. And then you can see the top point production, target monsters, rushing monsters, and the recent performance. So you can see who's overperforming and maybe due to crash, and you can see who's underperforming and maybe due to smash. Okay, let's see who we have at the running back position. My running back stud for Week 16 is Christian McCaffrey from the Carolina Panthers playing the Atlanta Falcons, who give up the 5th most fantasy points overall, and they give up the 5th most fantasy points to the running back position. Christian McCaffrey has scored 26, 28, and 34 fantasy points in his last 3 games, averaging 26.2 fantasy points per game on the season. He gets 8 targets per game and 14 rushes per game. That puts him over 20 touches per game. Christian McCaffrey is $8,800 DraftKings salary. He's $500 more on FanDuel, projected at 22.3 fantasy points here in Week 16. This is a home game for McCaffrey. They need this win. This is a great matchup against a team that can't stop the run, can't stop the pass. Perfect spot for Christian McCaffrey here in Week 16. Okay, now for a low salary running back who may fly under the radar. I like Jordan Howard from the Chicago Bears playing the San Francisco 49ers, who have the 6th worst defense overall, and they give up the 12th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Jordan Howard has scored 15, 14, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 games, averaging 10.3 fantasy points per game on the season. He gets 1 to 2 targets a game, and he gets 15.4 rushes per game. He got 19 rush attempts the last 2 games, and Jordan Howard is still only $4,300 DraftKings salary. He is $1,700 more on FanDuel, so if you're going to play a low salary running back on FanDuel, I would prefer Marlon Mack for not much more. But on DraftKings, $4,300, projected at 10.5 fantasy points here in Week 16. I think Jordan Howard gets around 20 touches again, which puts him in a good spot to hit value here on DraftKings. This is a game where the Chicago Bears may get up big on the San Francisco 49ers, and Jordan Howard may be that late game hammer as they try to run out the clock. Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. My Week 16 stud at wide receiver is Antonio Brown from the Pittsburgh Steelers, playing the New Orleans Saints, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, but they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Antonio Brown has scored 15, 9, and 34 fantasy points in his last 3 games, averaging 20.8 fantasy points per game on the season and an average of 10.6 targets per game. Antonio Brown is $8,300 DraftKings salary. He's $400 more on FanDuel, projected at 18.7 fantasy points here in Week 16. This is a great matchup for Antonio Brown. The Saints give up big-time yards to wide receivers. I love Antonio Brown versus the Saints in Week 16. Okay, now for a low-salary wide receiver who may fly under the radar. I like Robbie Anderson from the New York Jets, playing the Green Bay Packers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, but they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Robbie Anderson has scored 23, 18, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 games, averaging 10.6 fantasy points per game on the season. In an average of 6 targets per game, he got 11 targets last game. Robbie Anderson is $4,500 DraftKings salary, $1,400 more on FanDuel. I love that DraftKings price. Projected at 10.5 fantasy points here in Week 16. This is a home game for Robbie Anderson. He's got his quarterback Sam Darnold back. They looked great last week. Green Bay Packers, not very good versus the pass. Look for Robbie Anderson to have another big game versus the Packers here in Week 16. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. My Week 16 tight end stud is George Kittel from the San Francisco 49ers, playing the Chicago Bears, who have the 2nd best defense overall, but they're only middle of the pack defending opposing tight ends. George Kittel has scored 8, 37, and 13 fantasy points in his last 3 games, averaging 16 fantasy points per game on the season. He gets an average of 8 targets per game. George Kittel is $6,000 DraftKings salary, $1,400 more on FanDuel, projected at 15.4 fantasy points here in Week 16. I would stay away from Zach Ertz, who doesn't look to have much chemistry with Nick Foles yet. Of course, you never know how that's going to change after a week of practice, but for 100 more on DraftKings, I prefer George Kittel, who's got huge upside, and he's my favorite tight end stud on the slate. Okay, now for a low salary tight end who may fly under the radar. I like David Njoku for the Cleveland Browns, playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have the absolute worst defense overall and give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. David Njoku has scored 6, 7, and 4 fantasy points in the last 3 games, averaging 8.5 fantasy points per game on the season. He gets 5.6 targets per game, and David Njoku is $3,800 DraftKings salary, $1,500 more on FanDuel, projected at 8.2 fantasy points here in Week 16. We're waiting for this big game from David Njoku. David Njoku has a great matchup here in Week 16. It could be his breakout week versus a bad Cincinnati Bengals defense. If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. You've unlocked the bonus content. My super secret sleeper pick for Week 16 is Austin Hooper from the Atlanta Falcons, playing the Carolina Panthers, who give up the 10th most fantasy points overall, and they give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Austin Hooper has scored 0, 8, and 15 fantasy points in his last 3 games, averaging 10.4 fantasy points per game on the season. He gets almost 6 targets per game, although he only got 1 target last game, leading to that 0 points, which will lead to low ownership. Austin Hooper is only $3,700 DraftKings salary. He's $1,600 more on FanDuel, projected at 9.5 fantasy points here in Week 16. I think the Atlanta Falcons attack that weak Carolina defense with Austin Hooper. Carolina is weak versus tight ends. Austin Hooper wasn't involved last week. I expect that to change here in week 16. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smickety smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for week 16. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.